them, I'm in trouble. Ross, thank you for your prayers. January Mulan, thank you for beautiful singing. All the musicians, thank you. Rad, thank you for the lesson this morning. Everybody's contributed wonderfully there. But I'm going to change the tone now. We're going to step it up again. Mighty warriors there. Solomon says there's a time for everything. A time to love, a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. We see each of those times in our life there. In 2001, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, you all know them, they released a critically acclaimed miniseries called Band of Brothers. Anyone heard of Band of Brothers or seen Band of Brothers there? It's a 10-part series. It's based on actual events. It's based on books that are written by the people who were there in the Second World War. It tells the story of Easy Company. They were the elite American paratroopers of the time. They were the best of the best at the time. They were the first troops into Normandy on D-Day, and they fought in the biggest battles through to the surrender of Germany. Towards the end, they were the team that captured Hitler's famed Eagle's Nest retreat. But of most interest in the stories about these men are the relationships between the soldiers and their connections that were formed under the most trying of circumstances. They were closer than brothers. It's hard to imagine a bond closer than brothers. It's a bond where they willingly would give their lives for each other. And that's what drew me particularly to this story. I can imagine a church where we would willingly give our lives for each other. That is the ideal. Julie spoke about harmony and unity in her thought for the day this morning. And unless we've got a church where there's harmony and unity, we're only going to tear ourselves apart. I've seen it happen so many times. I'm not here to glorify war. War's a dreadful, horrific thing based on the whims of some dictatorial leaders, and everybody suffers as a result. But are you a warrior? Yes, you are. Are you a leader? Yes, every one of us here is a leader. We're all leaders and warriors. In some ways, we can all serve. We can serve bravely, we can lead courageously. And we've all got an influence in some way. Don't say you haven't got an influence, because we all influence the people around us. No matter your skills, no matter your age, no matter your sex, we can influence people for the good in a better way. And we need to be prepared no matter how useless we feel, because God's got a way of opening doors for each of us. He opens these doorways that we never saw before. We go, why didn't I see that before? But are we in a war right now? Do we need to be warriors now? Yes, we are in a war right now. All of us are involved. We're either on one side or the other. There's no neutral territory. There's no Switzerland in this war. The media are trying to hype up all the stories in the news. Everything we hear in the news is all doom and gloom. So whatever we read in the news, we've got to take and sift out fact from fiction, from those words they use to build things up to make them a lot bigger than what they should be. There. The Bible tells us of many wars. They're not just there to fill the pages. I know that some people don't like talking about wars, and some people say we're in a new age now, the New Testament, we need to talk about love. But the Old Testament is full of wars and history. It helps us prepare for the troubling times ahead. The Bible tells us that there's a great battle going on between good and evil, between Christ and Satan. There's a spiritual war going on at the moment, and we can all draw inspiration. Paul leads us in here. In Romans 15 he says, whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Did Paul have the New Testament at that time? Paul here is referring to the Old Testament, the Scriptures that he had in his hand. Meanwhile, Paul and the others were bringing in the New Testament. In the mini-series Band of Brothers, it focuses on the bond of brotherhood and the personal stories between the men of the 506 Parachute Regiment, and in particular, as I said, Easy Company. They were recognised among their peers as being some of the best, the men everyone wanted to look up to. These men were led by an extraordinary leader in Lieutenant Dick Winters. Dick Winters entered the war as a private. He signed up shortly after the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. He went to officer school, graduated at the head of his class, came out as a second lieutenant and was assigned to the paratroopers. Later in the war, he progressed to a captain and then to a major because of his extraordinary skills. Now, this company, Easy Company, was successful because of the combined efforts of the soldiers and their leaders. It wasn't one or the other. It was a combined effort of the team and their leadership working together here. We see examples in the Bible, and we see this specifically with King David and his mighty men. And before our TVs became saturated with stories of superheroes, there were real superheroes in the Old Testament. David had his mighty men. Can you read that at all? We're going on a story, on a journey here. These are the names of the mighty men who David had. Joshua, Bashabeth, the Tachomite, chief among the captains. He was called Adino the Esnite because he had killed 800 men at one time. What an incredible feat. 800 men. I mean, if that was in a movie, people wouldn't believe it these days. And after him was Eliezer, the son of Dodo, the Ahoite. They all have such long names and it takes a while to get through them. He was one of the three mighty men with David when they defeated the Philistines who had gathered there for battle. And the men of Israel had retreated. So all the men of Israel had retreated, but these mighty men stood their ground. He arose and attacked the Philistines until his hand was weary and his hand stuck to the sword. The Lord brought about a great victory that day, and the people returned after him, only to plunder. One man stood his ground, which allowed the Lord to bring about a great victory. All of Israel had run away and left him there. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agee, the Haravite. The Philistines had gathered together into a troop where there was a piece of ground full of lentils. So the people fled from the Philistines. Again, the people fled. But he stationed himself in the middle of the field, defended it, and killed the Philistines. So the Lord brought about a great victory. Again, another great victory. I think later on we read that it was about 300 men he killed at one time. Again, if there was a movie about this stuff, nobody would believe it. But the Bible tells us it was the Lord that brought about a great victory because of one person that stood their ground. And again, now Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was chief of another three. He lifted his spear against 300 men, killed them, and won a name among these three. These mighty warriors were able to do incredible things in the name of the Lord. Was it in the name of the Lord? It certainly was. The Bible here tells us it was the Lord that brought about the great victory through these men. These mighty men stood their ground against overwhelming odds, 800 to 1, and the others 300 to 1. When the others fled, they stood their ground. What makes someone stand their ground at a time like that? You see a whole army charging to you. What courage it must take to stand your ground unless you've got a firm conviction. We see the examples of these soldiers and the leadership working together. Their love for their leader David was so great that they risked their lives in the daring raids on the Philistines. We hear a story shortly. It's in the same chapter. 3 men risked their lives, not out of duty, but out of love for their leader David. It was based on a whim of David. Then 3 of the 30 chief men went down at harvest time and came to David at the cave of Adullam. And the troop of the Philistines encamped in the valley of Rephaim. David was then in the stronghold and the garrison of the Philistines. In the stronghold, and the garrison of the Philistines is in Bethlehem. And David said with longing, "Oh, that someone would give me a drink of the water from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." So the 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but he poured it out to the Lord. And he said, "Far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is this not the blood of the men who went in jeopardy of their lives?" Therefore, he would not drink it. When I first heard that story many, many years ago, I thought, that was a bit hard, David, pouring that water out. These men had gone such a great cost to get it for him. But then, looking closer into the story, David was honouring their act. He honoured their act by pouring the water out to God. In doing this, he showed how much he loved them and how much he loved God. And he could not selfishly consume the water. We see here a bond where these men would willingly give their lives for each other and for their leader. These 3 men were prepared to die for David based on love for him. Not on a command, not on duty, but because of their love for him. David was the rightfully anointed of God for the leadership of Israel. But David had been rejected by Saul. David had been rejected by the establishment of Israel at the time. But we see, as a leader, there was a certain type of person attracted to David. I found this interesting. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, so he became captain over them. And there were about 400 men with him. These weren't people who were just in distress about their electricity bill or the way the world's going. When you look closer at it, they're in distress because what's happening in the land, the spiritual condition of the place. They knew that David had been anointed, and so they fled to him. David had become a Messiah figure for the people. He represented the future hope of the people. And they trusted him so much, they followed him even against Saul and against the establishment. In the story of the band of brothers from the 506 Parachute Regiment, they parachuted behind the German lines before the troops had begun to land on D-Day. Easy Company's job was to take out and soften up the German fortifications to help the troops landing on Utah Beach in Normandy on D-Day. Unfortunately, Easy Company, with over 120 men, was dropped in the wrong positions and they were separated. They were without their weapons, without their survival gear. And Lieutenant Dick Winters tells that out of 81 troop planes dropping troops behind the lines, only 10 dropped anywhere near their intended position. The others far overshot the mark. The plane carrying the leaders of the company was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed, killing all of the officers and leaders. This made Lieutenant Winters the senior surviving officer, and he would have to take command. He'd lost his weapons. They were dropped in the wrong spot. And all he landed with was one knife. He had one knife tucked in his boot. And he was being fired at by machine guns nearby, shooting at him. He wasn't afraid, he says in his book, because his training had begun to kick in. All the plans had gone out, but training, he said, solidified him. He knew he had to get weapons. He knew he had to bring his men together. And after he'd avoided the machine gun that was firing at him, he managed to get some weapons. He re-established a group of 12 men. And with those 12 men, he assaulted a German artillery fortification of 4 large guns that were bombing Utah Beach and firing on the landing soldiers. These 4 large guns had 50 Germans with machine guns protecting them. And Lieutenant Winters and his 12 paratroopers with rifles took that position. They knocked out those guns, one after the other. They knocked out the machine guns. In doing so, they saved the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of other soldiers that were landing on Utah Beach. And for their courage and for their action, everyone in that group received the Silver or Bronze Star. Lieutenant Winters was given the Distinguished Service Cross for his courage in regrouping and leading the team. The key to all this was all their plans had gone out the window. They'd landed in the wrong position. They landed without the correct gear. But because of their training, everyone knew their job. They were able to regroup together. They came together as a team and they were able to achieve a job far above what they should have been able to achieve. Easy Company had trained for 2 years together and they were in peak physical condition. These men could run rings around anybody. They ran for miles every day. They climbed mountains every day. They trained in all types of weather. They trained with every type of weapon for over 2 years. Nobody could come close to them. And Major Winters in his book tells the story of when training, they played a professional group of basketballers, or a semi-professional group of basketballers in their off time. Those semi-professional basketballers had ball skills that were much better, and they were expected to win easily. But the Easy Company soldiers ran the basketballers so hard around the court, the basketballers' legs gave out, and Easy Company got the win in the game of basketball. They were all very proud of that. Anyway, back to D-Day. It was their training they credit for their survival, for the victory that they got on that day. They fell back on the instincts that were so ingrained in their nature and their character there. Back to King David. King David shows us how important training is. When David arrived on the battlefield and Goliath was throwing thunderbolts of abuse at the Israelites, David was amazed. David's instant reaction was to jump up and take control. David didn't have a plan. He fell back on his training from his shepherd boy youth days. In his youth, he'd fought lions, he'd fought bears, he'd protected the flock. And all this with a staff and a sling. David wasn't scared of Goliath. David reverted back instantly to the skill sets that he'd learnt beforehand. You can see where I'm going with this. And David was taken to Saul, and Saul said to David, "You're not able to go up against this Philistine to fight him, for you're a youth and he a man of war from his youth." I think it incredible that David got an audience with Saul. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." I think Saul must have had some courage too at that time, because to send a boy to represent his entire nation when Saul himself, the king, wouldn't take on this Philistine. And we'll continue with this story. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. Goliath, the Bible says, was 6 cubits and a span. That equates to about 9.5 feet tall. That is big. He was a monster. And here David, we're told, he was a youth, ruddy and good looking. A monster against David. So the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, "Come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." Just remember that little bit. Come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. It is significant later. Then David said to the Philistines, "You come to me with a sword or a spear, with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand." David showed no fear. He had courage. He had conviction. "And I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give your carcass to the camp of the Philistines, to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth." Here's David saying, "I'm going to feed you to the birds." Goliath's saying to David, "I'm going to feed you to the birds." so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all the assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. This is where David had the conviction and the courage to stand up against such overwhelming odds. It's where those mighty men, when the Israelites fled and left them in the field on their own, they had the conviction and the courage to stand. How important is training? Not for physical battle only, although we need to keep ourselves in the best physical condition we can. Our training consists of learning the Word of God that God's given us, of serving others, of helping others. It's all part of our training that we're going to need to fall back on when we're faced with overwhelming odds. Because Peter tells us, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Our training's not for the future, our training is for now. We don't know when we're going to be assaulted, when we're going to have to rise to the challenge. We need to prepare now and start our training now. Moses was also training for 40 years for his role in the wilderness. We read about Gideon. He was in training. Jehoshaphat was in training, and countless other heroes of the Bible were all in training before they were called. But when they were called, they were immediately able to stand up. We only just learnt recently, a couple of weeks ago, about Abraham. When his nephew Lot was captured by the Moabites, Abraham didn't have to prepare everything and train his men. These men were ready in an instant. Abraham got them up and they went and rescued. Abraham was a warrior. In fact, the rulers of the surrounding cities were concerned about Abraham. They went to make peace with him. They called him a mighty prince. They knew he was, and they knew Abraham's God. But back to Dick Winters. As a leader, he was not like the other leaders. His mother had an Amish Mennonite background. You know who the Amish are in America. They're very conservative, fundamentalist people. He attended church every Sunday. He tells in the book that he only missed church 3 times due to exercises in the army. He went every day while he was in the army. When the other officers went to the pub and partied, Major Winters stayed in his barracks and he studied his officers' manuals. He read his strategic books. He studied, he learnt while the others were out partying. And he spent quiet time in reflection. He said he would often find joy in sitting alone, peacefully and reflecting. In fact, he never swore. And when he heard in the movie series that Tom Hanks and Spielberg had portrayed his character as using cuss words, he rang Tom Hanks and he said, if you put me in the movie as swearing, he'd withdraw all his support for the movie. Tom Hanks and Spielberg ignored that at first, and then Major Winters called them back again and said, I will not tolerate it. He said, I'll withdraw all my support from the movie. And eventually they took all swearing out of that movie associated with him. He didn't want to be known for that. Now, the original Easy Company was led by First Lieutenant Sobel. Lieutenant Sobel was in charge of Lieutenant Winters. There were 2 lieutenants leading. But Lieutenant Sobel led the men by strict discipline and fear. And using strict discipline and fear, it built them up to a certain level. But eventually the men started to rebel. And this brought about a big conflict. There was a huge confrontation, and eventually through a series where Dick Winters was taken for court-martial, Dick Winters eventually became leader of Easy Company, and the men were quite pleased because the men were willing to surrender their stripes. They went to the general and said, "We're going to hand in our stripes if you punish Dick Winters." The men were mutinying because they wanted him back in the team. There was another king of Israel who felt the weight of pressure to keep his people safe from the threat of war. And I'll get to King Jehoshaphat shortly, but there's another important point why these men followed Dick Winters. When faced with imminent threat, the soldiers of Easy Company asked Dick Winters to get them home safely. They went to him and said, "Can you please get us home safely?" He said it was a promise he couldn't keep, but he did promise to do his best to keep them safe. He became a father figure for his men, and he felt aged before his years. And this was all when he was only 26 years old, a young man far beyond his years. And back to Jehoshaphat, who was faced with overwhelming odds and tragedy, and he feared for his people. Now, what did Jehoshaphat do? He set himself to seek the Lord. This could have been a huge tragedy if Jehoshaphat had taken it upon himself, if he thought he could do it. Jehoshaphat had been busy reforming Israel. He'd been tearing down the idols that the people had previously been worshipping. He'd been leading the people back to the real God. And Chronicles tells us it happened after this that the people of Moab with the people of Ammon and the others with them beside the Ammonites came to battle against Jehoshaphat. Then some came and told Jehoshaphat, saying, "A great multitude is coming against you from beyond the sea, from Syria, and are in Hazaz Tamar, which is En-gedi." And Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord. Jehoshaphat set himself to seek the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast throughout all of the land. A true leader can do these things for his people, and this is what he did. So Judah gathered together to ask help from the Lord, and from all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord. All the people came together. And Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court and said, "O Lord, God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven? And do you not rule over all the kingdoms and nations? And in your hand is there not power and might, so that no one is able to withstand you? Are you not our God, who drove out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and gave it to the descendants of Abraham, your friend forever? And they dwell in it and have built you a sanctuary in it for your name, saying, if disaster comes upon us, sword, judgment, pestilence, or famine, we will stand before this temple and in your presence, for your name is in this temple, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. And now here are the people of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came out of the land of Egypt. But they turned from them and did not destroy them. Here they are now, rewarding us by coming to throw us out of your possession.